So I'll pause here so we can record. This program will be recorded and available on the OWAC website in a few days. So as a reminder, my name is Amy Van Serksum, and I'm the president of the Olympia World Affairs Council this year. And I'm pleased to present to you tonight Gary Wasserman, retired professor of government at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service in Doha, Qatar. Tonight, he's going to speak to us about his book, The Doha Experiment, Arab Kingdom, Catholic College, Jewish Teacher. Professor Wasserman's book is part memoir, part current events, and part amusing insights into the embattled region, as it's based on his 8 years teaching at Georgetown University's new branch in Doha, Qatar. Gary explores what happens to the Arab students who attend, especially the women, the impact on America's relations to this critical region, and whether liberal education has a future in the harsh political climate of the Arab Gulf. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to Gary.
Amy, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
I've mastered the mute button, which is a good start. Let me start with a story, and it's about a girl in my class. And I say girl because in Arab societies, if you're unmarried, you're referred to as a girl. And until you get married, then you become a woman. And having had a daughter who at age 9 insisted on being called a woman, I took some getting used to, among other things there. Aisha came to my office. She had been in my class a couple years before, and she wanted a recommendation to go to graduate school in London. And she was a good student. I was prepared to do that. And I asked her what she wanted to study. And it soon became apparent she didn't really know. And so we kind of danced around it, as students and teachers are wont to do in these office meetings. And finally, she said, well, look, to tell you the truth, I don't know what I want to study, but I know I want to get to London, because if I stay in Doha, my parents are going to pressure me into getting married. And I don't want to do that. And they will let me go to London to study graduate school. And I want to do that because I want to get out of here. And so I eventually wrote the recommendation. Now, when Georgetown decided to put its foreign service school, or a branch of its foreign service school, in Doha, in capital of Qatar, in the middle of the Persian Gulf, it probably wasn't intending to be a travel agent for co-eds trying to avoid marriage. And yet, in a curious way, this was a product of the liberal education they were providing. It was a question of this conflict, which was very real, between liberal education and, if you like, a traditional family or traditional structures that were going on in that society. And so one of the things that this reminded me of is, while you don't exactly know the consequences of bringing something like a university to a traditional Arab society, those consequences are very apparent once you're there. And so when Georgetown opened its school in 2005, it had a variety of motives, as did the Qataris, in inviting Georgetown in. For starters, it was joining something called Education City. And Education City consisted of 6 American universities. And they were designed to train the Qataris, as well as others, in various parts of what were considered, if you like, a modern society. So there was, for doctors, Cornell Medical School located its medical facilities there. Journalists were provided by Northwestern's journalism school. Businessmen could learn computer skills and business in Carnegie Mellon's school there. Texas A&M provided petroleum engineers. And so you can see that they had divided, if you like, the education that they needed based on the kinds of jobs they wanted to fill. And the Foreign Service School was invited in order to train bureaucrats, in order to train diplomats and bureaucrats who would provide a functioning government apparatus, both in Qatar and abroad. The problem with this training, if you like, and this was explained when Georgetown was in discussions with them about locating, is Georgetown prided itself not so much on training professionals as on providing liberal education. That was something about providing the whole person in allowing the person to develop their skills, their talents, their creative facilities in an educational setting. So Georgetown was quite prepared to defend a liberal education as something that they were providing. It wasn't just a matter of filling slots in a bureaucracy for them. It was training, or if you like, educating the whole person. Well, one of the things that was going on, of course, is there was an agreement to disagree on this. So as one high-ranking Qatari official said to the Georgetown deans at an early stages, you may be providing a liberal education, but don't say it too often, because that's not exactly what the Qataris were hoping for. They really wanted, well, there's a range of things that they wanted, as is any kind of governmental apparatus, is different people wanting different things. On one hand, they wanted the gold standard in higher education, which was an American education. American universities, much to my own surprise, are really the gold standard in the world. And so they wanted, and they could afford to buy it, they wanted that diploma from an American university for their children. And so they got that with Georgetown. And so sometimes we kind of muse to ourselves among the faculty that what they wanted was a picture on the wall, which would be the diploma, and that the education itself was probably of secondary concern. Now, admittedly, there was a kind of a range of opinions among the Qataris as to what they were getting and what they wanted. But there was certainly a sense of branding. Qatar, because of its natural gas reserves, it was in fact the third largest producer of natural gas in the world, was a very small country with a lot of money. There's probably about 600,000 Qataris in a country of 3 million, the rest being expatriates. So to educate their children, as well as students from throughout the Middle East, from Bosnia to Pakistan, they were prepared to provide this education at home. Now, part of this, of course, was they had been funding their own students going abroad for their education to the States, et cetera, and they wanted to kind of incorporate that in their own education system. They saw themselves as providing education for the region, as well as getting a status that came with having prestige schools located within their territory. So part of this was, again, a branding exercise on the part of their leadership. Part of it was a genuine concern for education of their children. The question some of the leaders put to administrators at Georgetown was, what are we going to do when the natural gas runs out? And they would bring up the historical analogy of the Spanish, and the Spanish who busy exploited the gold in the Americas. When that gold ran out, so did the status of Spain as a great power. And they worried that this would happen to Qatar. Qatar wealth was a rather new occurrence. 2 generations ago, the Qataris were desert people, mostly illiterate tribes in a very poor area of the world. And the discovery of natural gas offshore, a field that they shared with the Iranians, made them wealthy literally overnight in the 70s when they started exploiting it. And so they had this question of what do they do with all this money? Now, they're now spending a rumored $100 billion of it with the football championship coming to Qatar in the fall of this year. What do they call it? The Super Bowl? Well, they don't call it. So the World Cup, sorry, showing my ignorance of soccer. The World Cup would be coming in the fall of this year, and that's costing them rumors of $100 billion. So they have a fair amount of money. They're willing to spend it for various things, including education. So there was this range of motives, if you like, on a Qatari side in terms of educating their students, becoming branded with a place that you could go for higher education in the Gulf, as well as providing that kind of prestige for themselves in the region. The American side of it had also a myriad of motives. The old story about the imperialists of God, glory, and gold was not totally absent from the Georgetown's calculation. $50 to $60 million a year is not to be sneezed at, which was what they were kind of getting for this. They also, in fairness, the deans at the time were former Foreign Service officers. They saw this as an exercise of soft power on the Americans' part. They saw this in the year, and this was a few years after 9/11 had occurred, as a chance to show the Middle East what American education was like, to provide that kind of ties to the region that you could get through education, and a reminder that American culture was something more than sending troops to a region that we had some experience sending troops to already. So that you could provide both a way to kind of grow friends in that region, supplement the two Air Force bases that were in Qatar at the time, and provide access to an important source of resources in that region. So it was a chance for Georgetown to kind of demonstrate its international reach, gain prestige for it, as well as providing some access to what we considered to be liberal education. Now, one of the things my colleagues, if you were asking them, what are you teaching? They might well say to you, well, I'm teaching my students to think. I don't care what they think about. I don't care what kind of politics they have. I want them to learn how to think, how to reason, how to do research, how to, in fact, think. Now, that's not entirely true, of course. Nobody was there, none of my colleagues that I knew, was there because we wanted to educate people to become racist, to become xenophobic, to become misogynist, to become anti-Semites. We were, in fact, had our own, if you like, baggage of values. Scratch a liberal and you'll find a missionary. We were also there to try to impart our own values to the students we were teaching. Now, in many ways, of course, this set up a clash. And I saw that with Aisha trying to get out of that situation. And you saw that mainly with a lot of the women students. In many ways, the women students, and it was a co-ed school, it was run as a co-ed school, which was unusual for education below the college level in Qatar. But people were, women were in the classrooms, they're mixed in, they were in fact among usually the better students. They were not intimidated by guys in the classrooms. They were smart, they were confident, they were assertive. And in fact, they did quite well. And there was also, of course, social mixing, which was also not heard of in Qatari society. So people would have coffee afterwards, they'd be in Education City, there'd be co-ed mixing. Again, they'd go back to their families in the evening, and then they'd be separated by gender. So again, this was a kind of a liberal, if you like, ghetto. This was a kind of something different from the rest of the society. Now, the question, of course, is then what happens? What happens when these women graduate? And I mentioned Aisha and her trying to defer that kind of decision. Many of us thought that what we're doing was something similar to educating Blacks in this country in the 1940s from the South. They really weren't going to go back to the South with that education. There was no, in general, place for them to use that advanced education. So they ended up in the northern cities. In a similar ways, many of their students that graduated Georgetown would end up in that global community. They'd end up in London or Paris. They'd end up in New York or Washington. They'd be working for international corporations. They'd be working for international organizations. They'd be working for nonprofits. They might be working for the government overseas. It was difficult for them to immediately come back to their own societies and fit in very well. That is not to say they didn't. And there was a mixed result of their education. Some ended up, if you like, speaking the language of liberalism without actually walking the walk. So they'd go back into their families, they'd marry, they'd try to preserve the education they had, they'd talk it, they wouldn't necessarily walk it. They wouldn't necessarily get jobs that could use their education. Now, having said that, the society itself was, I don't want to paint a picture of a traditional society that is rigid or unchanging, because in fact, at the same time, Qatar was changing. Women were, in fact, had high positions in the government. Women, they could drive, even though it was a Wahhabi part of Islam, they in fact, it was considered Wahhabi light. It was not like Saudi Arabia. One of my friends who was Greek said it was much like the difference between Athens and Sparta. Athens was a port city. Sparta was a landlocked country, or a country inland. Saudi Arabia, in the same way, was not as open to outside influences like a port of Doha was. And so Qatar was a relatively liberal place for a traditional society. Al Jazeera was a network started by the Emirate in Doha and broadcast to the rest of the Arab world and internationally, in fact, and would have all kinds of guests, including Israelis, on it. I spoke there several times, etc. It was an attempt by Qatar to again spread, if you like, the Arab street, to allow much more liberal engagement among Arab politicos. And so Qatar itself was changing. And it was, what was happening, of course, is Georgetown had to adapt to a different society, but in fact, in the process, it was also changing. So for instance, like most American universities, we would sponsor extracurricular activities. And there was constant attempts to invite the families to these, they'd have these lectures, we'd have debates, we'd have discussions. Very few Qatari family members would attend. And I remember being at a dinner with one Qatari father who was there. And I said, we don't get very many fathers here for our dinners. And he said, why would I want to have dinner with strangers when I can have dinner with my family? A reasonable question, of course. But again, this was not an orientation to the kinds of thing we've come to expect in our education. I want to talk about another woman who I met in New York after she graduated, and her name was Atika. This is not, I've kind of changed the names in my book because I don't necessarily want to kind of violate privacy of these individuals. And again, my book is not actually circulated in Qatar, which is again part of this kind of you don't discuss these things in Qatar. It's not used to kind of a public politics. But anyway, Atika was in New York, and she talked to me about trying to stay there for graduate school. She had come there. She talked about her background, about growing up a female in Qatar, and she talked about how when she was young, she used to ask questions, and she was a strong, ambitious woman. I should preface this by saying. And she talked about how when her younger brother went out bicycle riding, she'd ask her parents, well, can I have a bicycle and go out riding? And they say, no, you can't. You're a girl. Girls don't ride bicycles. And she didn't understand that. She wanted to ride bicycles. She thought she could, et cetera, et cetera. And she found that with her ambition and her strength of will, she was constantly being restrained and held back. And so having said that, the parents were okay with her doing something with her education as long as it wasn't taken too far. And she was so she had to wear an abaya, which is the robes worn by women, dark robes that most of the women wear. That is not a sign of religious belief, incidentally. It's usually just a sign of that nationalism, is kind of identifying yourself as a Qatari. And at some point, she wanted to go to New York to graduate school after she graduated Georgetown. Her parents let her go, but she had to live with her younger brother who went to New York. And she said he was a member of the other team. So he was there to monitor her. And when I spoke to her, she said, I've now had it. I'm telling my parents, I'm not going back to Qatar. I'm used to living a different life. I don't want to go back to kind of these gender specific roles that I can't mix with other guys and women in a social setting outside of the home. And I don't want to go back to that setting. So she was staying in New York. And so her choice, and it was a difficult one, not only because of her ties, her emotional ties with her parents, but of course she lived very well in Qatar. And this was a wealthy family. She knew the privileges she had. She knew the servants she could have. She would go back. She'd be able to get a job. She'd be able to have the kids taken care of by servants. But she didn't want that lifestyle anymore. She had outgrown that lifestyle, and she didn't want to engage in that back in Qatar. But her choice wasn't to go back and do that at this stage of the game. It was to stay outside of Qatar. And that, unfortunately, was what the women at least faced. That was their choice. The guys, incidentally, could have it both ways. They could, in fact, get that American education. They could go back into the home. They could have a family. They could have their jobs. They could have the product of their education. And so they weren't, in fact, confined as much as the women were. They also there were other, of course, it gets more complicated. So for instance, I talked to some of my students who were gay, and they also would be accepted in the family as long as they weren't confronting it. In other words, there was a great deal of tolerance towards this kind of behavior, if you like, as long as it didn't undermine the family. So if you were expected to get married, you could conduct yourself as gay on the side, and as long as they weren't confronting that all the time, there was a great deal of tolerance towards that behavior. I mean, people knew you were gay, they would accept it, they would accept your relationships with other guys, in the case of men, and with women as well. And of course, in a society where you're growing up separated by genders, there's a great deal of opportunity for people, in fact, of both sexes to have relations with people of the same sex. So in a curious way, there was some kind of encouragement of this, maybe inadvertently, in the society, the way it was structured. Now, I just want to wrap up something, and we'll leave time for questions and comments. You know, when I wrote this book, it starts like a politically incorrect joke. A Jewish guy goes to a Wahhabi Arab kingdom, teaches American politics at a Catholic college. And the problem is that's a little bit of a fabrication. And it's a little bit of a fabrication because when you start using categories like Arab and American, Muslim, Jewish, student, teacher, whatever, what you're doing, of course, is answering the question, who are you, in a rather abstract way. The question of who are you, it seems to me, is a multiple choice question. And one of the discoveries you come to after a certain amount of time in this kind of society is that, in fact, the students you're teaching and the people you're talking with are, in fact, multiple identities. No one is just an Arab or just an American. They are people who will share different values. They may laugh at the same jokes. They may outrage at the same injustices. They may sympathize with the same poverties. And people were, in fact, multiple identities that I met. There were people with a range of political beliefs, a range of religious beliefs, and a range of views towards the world. So what you had, in fact, were, in fact, all kinds of people trying to find their ways in societies that were also evolving. Many of the students who ended up at Georgetown were, in fact, fairly alienated from their own societies. The societies they came from were, in many cases, the Middle East, a mess. When you're coming from a Syria or a Lebanon or an Iraq or an Afghanistan or a Palestine, you're dealing with a background that leaves you trying, in many ways, to just get out of there, and certainly to find your own way in the world. One of the, the tendency when you're talking about students overseas is to make them more exotic than they are. If you had come into my classroom at any point and see what was going on there, the classes were conducted in English, you would have been comfortable in an American setting. You would have thought this could be an American setting. Some of the students were Americans. Some, I never quite figured out whether they were Americans or others, because in fact, I had one girl who was, her name was Asmia, and I thought she was Somali. And it turns out that she grew up in West Virginia to Somali parents, but she was a fan of the Mountaineers football team at the University of West Virginia. So there was a mixture of people in this setting, and people trying to find their way through education to something different. In some ways, of course, students were different from Americans I taught here, for instance, in their familiarity with war. People had grown up in societies that had a lot of violence in them. I remember a Lebanese girl who was talking about every time she heard a jet, she got frightened because she had been used to jets from Israel flying over her village in southern Lebanon. So you didn't have to give much instructions about the dangers of peace being eroded in your international relations class to a class that was quite familiar with what happens when societies disintegrate. So there were all kinds of political backgrounds like that you wouldn't expect in an American setting. But I left Qatar with a great deal of affection for my students. I think we're doing the right things. I think America has something to offer people in this part of the world. And I think they're grateful and using it fully when we're there. So thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have.
So Gary, thank you so much. Why don't I share my screen, and as people put their questions in the chat box, you can speak to some of the photos that you shared. Would that be all right?
Sure.
Great. Let me do that here. Great. Here you go. Can you see it?
Yeah. This is the skyline of Qatar. It's taken a few years ago. Notable by the cranes. I know in China they say the national bird is a crane, and that also could apply to Doha. And in the foreground you have a hotel on an island, and then the background is the burgeoning skyline of Qatar. I often thought that the skyscrapers looked like they had been dropped down from somewhere else, and they looked like they might leave at any moment. But it was a place with great dreams of what they would build Doha up to be. Many of the buildings were, in fact, largely empty. They were built, they were prestige symbols. they were part of what would, the hope was, would grow into a major metropolis. And there was a rivalry, of course, with Dubai, which was 150 miles down the coast. And they wanted Doha to kind of build itself up to deal with the rivalry with Abu Dhabi and their capital city of Dubai. More pictures?
Yeah, do you see the next picture? Did it change for you?
Yeah, there it is.
Great.
This is walking on the Corniche, which is along the riverfront, and you'll see the workers in the front. Yeah, on the waterfront, and a woman and a Qatari woman, and a guy wearing a thobe, walking along the riverfront. This was actually a building going on. I think they were building Northwestern University here. And you can see these laborers, mostly South Asian, working 10-hour days at least in the hot sun. And this kind of construction was going on all the time. That's me with some of my students. That's our cafeteria. This building was put up about 5 years after I came there. Again, a little bit corporate, fairly extravagant building that housed the Georgetown School of Foreign Service. That's our residence, where I lived with my wife, Anne, for 8 years. And we lived in we lived in a compound. So there were, say, 40 of these kind of townhouses surrounded by a wall with a rising, with a gate that had a kind of something that could presumably stop a truck from coming in. So security was in the back of people's minds when they designed this compound, and it was mostly expats living there. We had a clubhouse in the middle. It was a very comfortable existence.
Great, thank you. That was your last photo, so I'll stop sharing and then we can move to questions. So let's see. I do think you answered this, but maybe you want to speak to it a bit more. Was the school confined to Qataris, or did it include international students? Do you want to elaborate a bit on that maybe?
Yeah, about a third of the school were Qataris. One of the, and they were about 60% women, 40% men. One of the problems they had was the men didn't tend to be very good students. They hadn't worked very hard. Their English wasn't very good, so you had to go to a bridge program and get their English up to date. The foreign students, mostly on scholarships, range from, I say, from Bosnia to Pakistan, largely from the Muslim countries in that region. And they came in with a generous scholarship from the Qatar government. Qatar government wanted to keep the standards up for the school, and you really couldn't do that with just a Qatari student body. So the foreign students, who were generally very good, were brought in to, again, keep the standards at a level that would be internationally accepted.
So they increased the curve.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And again, and some were Americans. We had Americans coming in. There were people who had served in the military who came in after that for education.
Sure, great. So the next question is, Qatar was a destination for nearly all the evacuation planes leaving Afghanistan. Why Qatar? Can you describe the politics and the geography of this destination?
Yeah, Qatar prided itself. Qatar's a small country, and it's a wealthy country. And their main opposition, if you like, is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia borders Qatar. Saudi Arabia has claim to land in Qatar. and they've always resented Qatar as a kind of uppity younger brother. And of course, you know, the closer you are, and Saudi Arabia is larger. So without American protection, there was a feeling that Saudi Arabia might well decide to grab much more of Qatar property than they had already. So there were 2 Air Force bases in Qatar, which the Qataris built for the American armed forces. And after they were asked to leave Saudi Arabia, they came to Qatar. So Qatar was a kind of a key part of the Afghan war, and many of the drones that were used in the Middle East, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, were directed from headquarters in outside of Doha. So that was a familiarity they had. Now, Qatar, having said that, also was very careful to play it both ways in their foreign policy. They generally had good relations with Iran, for instance, and they tried to balance off some of the radical parts of the Arab world with some of the more moderate parts. Generally, conservative Arab regimes, including Egypt and Syria before the Abbas regime, didn't look very favorably on Qatar. It was considered a little bit too liberal and supportive of kind of radical movements like the Muslim Brotherhood. And so, for instance, one of the first flags that went up in Libya when they overthrew Gaddafi was the Qatari flag, because Qatar had been putting a lot of money into the people who were revolting against Gaddafi. So Qatar was playing a lot of different angles, if you like, as an active participant in Middle Eastern politics.
So the next question, it actually probably relates back to your previous question about the students, but Georgetown is an elite school. Were entrance requirements the same in Qatar and DC?
The short answer is yes. Now, having said that, I think Georgetown and DC's acceptance rate is about 12 to 15%. In Qatar, the acceptance rate is about 50%. So it's not quite as restrictive. Having said that, the curriculum is exactly the same. Most of the professors there are, in fact, from Washington, and were as qualified as any teachers in Washington. It's interesting that you asked that question, because the Qataris, of course, were very concerned that their education was identical with what they were getting in Washington. And they didn't want to be getting, if you like, a cut rate education. So one of the most common questions that people applying to the school would ask is, will my diploma say the same thing as a diploma in Washington? And they were assured that the diplomas were exactly the same. Now, the problem is the diploma was in Latin. So they didn't quite know what this meant. So people would ask me, thinking that I knew, of course, what does this diploma say in Latin? I said, well, the short version is Jesus hates losers. And that seemed to satisfy them.
That's what you told them? Okay, the next question is, what sort of jobs did the male students end up in?
Again, either with a large percentage of them would end up with international corporations. So they were valued for their language skills, for their familiarity with the Middle East, and they'd end up, one very good student ended up with Exxon, they'd end up with multinational corporations. Some would end up in the government. We had the Emir's sons went to Georgetown, and a couple of his daughters as well. And they would end up at the vice premier was 5 years after he graduated Georgetown, he became the vice premier. That may have had to do with his fact he was a member of the Al Thani family, which is the ruling elite, but he was also a good student. I'm not sure that had much to do with it. But so they end up in a myriad of positions, mostly with the government and mostly with multinational corporations. Some ended up with embassies overseas as well.
Great, thank you. Can you talk about the up and down relationship between Qatar and Israel?
Yeah, when I was there, and I was there till 2014, Israel had a consulate there, had a trade mission. And the trade mission lasted till about, I don't remember which conflict it was, but it lasted till about 2010. And then it was withdrawn because of one of the conflicts broke out with the Palestinians, and they were asked to leave. That is since, those ties have since been resumed. And there's now again a kind of a low level representation from Israel. And I think with the rest of the Gulf, or at least Bahrain and UAE resuming having relations with Israel, Qatar is likely to come back into that gambit as well. Qatar has a lot of informal relations with the Israelis. We had the Israeli Vice President Perez came to visit us actually, and was on Al Jazeera and spoke to the Georgetown student body while I was there. At the same time, and this is part of the kind of craziness of the region, the students who were photographed with him, pictures went up online, and they were in fact received death threats. So there was this mixed bag going on. There was some encouragement. Our student body did have a trip to Israel and Palestine while I was there. There was great opposition among the faculty to that trip. Georgetown, to its credit, insisted that the trip take place. 20, 25 students visited there and came back with a great deal of information and understanding for both Palestine and Israel when they came back. So there was attempts at reaching out. They were, sporadic and not altogether successful, but again, it's kind of moving in that direction.
Great. And then maybe building on that, a little different direction, could you talk a little bit about the government of Qatar and its international relations?
Right. Well, the government is it's an emirate, and it's headed by Sheikh Tamim, who is the son of Khalifa, who was the emir when I was there. And he was kind of very, very distinguished, very accomplished person who actually built up Education City through his wife, the Sheikh Moza, who was very important in founding Education City and in making sure it was subsidized. So the regime is run by the emirate and run by the Al Thani family, from which the high government officials kind of come. It's international relations, again, it's a small, wealthy country. So it's very involved. Its sovereign wealth fund, which is one of the largest in the world, is involved in everything from subsidizing soccer teams in Paris and London, not London, but one of the English soccer teams is, you'll see at Qatar Airways. And so they're involved in using their wealth in many ways to brand their country. One of the themes of their foreign policy is branding. They want Qatar to be known as a friends to all, that they provide mediation, for instance, in many of the conflicts going on in Africa and Asia. They provide help to the Americans when you were mentioning Afghanistan, the withdrawal there. They also provided a forum for the negotiations with the Taliban. If you recall, they took place in Doha. One of the things Qatar prides itself on doing is providing these kind of mediation services in conflicts in the world. And so and if you notice, when the Europeans were looking for other sources of gas and liquid natural gas in the world, they went to Qatar. The German president, I think, visited Qatar in the last few weeks to try to open up more trade in liquid natural gas going to Germany. So Qatar has basically kind of positioned itself as being an honest broker, a friend of America, as witnessed by the 2 Air Force bases there, and being relatively empathetic with the rest of the Middle East. Having said that, they did suffer from a boycott led by the Saudis for the last few years, which is initiated in the beginning part of the Trump presidency, and has since ended with Trump leaving power. That was again a kind of a fight. It's almost a family fights that go on. You never quite know why it's going on, and it takes place because somebody insulted somebody else, or there was personal antagonism, and that has to do with a lot of the kind of conflicts in the Gulf area. But that's since been kind of papered over. The relations with the neighbors are now pretty good. They maintain, as I said, pretty good relations with Iran, which they share this natural gas field with, and their relations with the Saudis have improved. And they again try to provide this kind of honest broker position, which in many ways has served American interests. When America wants access to groups like the Taliban, they go to the Qataris.
Great, thank you. I'm going to pause here. I know we have a couple of people who have joined us by phone, so I want to give them a chance if they have any questions to unmute and ask their question. And while we wait to see if any of the phone-in participants have any questions, I just want to encourage anyone else in the audience to feel free to add your questions to the chat box, and we'll see if we have any additional questions. Okay, seems like we have concluded our questions for the evening, unless someone comes up with one relatively quickly. So I want to thank you so much, Gary, for sharing your experience, telling us about your book, and I'll certainly encourage people to pick up a copy of your book and read it. I understand from those in our membership and board who have read it, found it to be quite interesting and humorous, and a very good and easy read, because apparently you're a very good writer, so they enjoyed reading it. So I encourage you to everyone to read Gary's book. And as a couple of final notes, this concludes our official program year. However, please do watch your emails. We are working on a potential extra program towards the middle to the end of May. And so if we are able to coordinate that, we will certainly invite all of you to that. And this recording, this program and other programs from this program year are available through the Olympia World Affairs Council website. So please do feel free to watch them again, or share them with your friends, encourage them to watch the videos as well. So thank you again, Gary. We appreciate your time tonight, and thank you everyone for joining us.